The fog came in thick that morning, rolling off the water in slow white waves, swallowing the village whole. Marrow Cove, a name that existed on no map he had ever studied, in no file his men had ever compiled, in no corner of the empire he had spent 15 years building with blood and silence and control. And yet, here he stood, at 5 minutes past dawn, on a narrow stone path leading to a cottage door painted the color of faded sky, his coat heavy with mist, his heart beating in a way it had not beaten in 4 years. He had not knocked. He could not bring himself to. Not yet. Not until the sound from inside settled into something he could name. There it was. A child's laughter. High, bright, careless. The kind of sound that belonged to a world without edges. A chair pushed back. Footsteps, small and uneven, followed by a voice so quiet he almost missed it. "Careful, little bird, you will knock the whole table over." His chest locked, his lungs refused to move. Because that voice had lived inside his skull for 4 years, replaying itself in the silence between orders and violence, and sleepless nights that stretched longer than any empire was worth. Revna. The door opened before he was ready. Maybe she had seen him through the window. Maybe she had felt what he felt. That invisible pull that distance and years had never managed to sever. Either way, the door swung inward, and the world became very still. She stood in the frame, backlit by the warm amber glow of a kitchen fire. Her feet bare on cold stone, her hair longer than he remembered, pulled into a loose twist that left strands across her face. She wore a wool sweater too large for her frame, the sleeves rolled back, her hands dusted with flour. The scar was still there. It always would be. That pale ridge of skin running from her left jaw down her neck, curving just below her ear like a river drawn by something cruel. The first time he had seen it, years ago, the world had been loud around them both. Now the world was silent, and the scar looked different, not smaller, just part of her in a way that made it impossible to separate from everything else he had never been able to forget. Then he saw the child. A girl standing just behind Revna's hip, one hand gripping the fabric of her sweater, the other holding a wooden spoon like a sword. She was small, with dark hair that curled at the ends and skin that held the same warmth as her mother's. She looked up at him, and the ground disappeared beneath his feet. Gray eyes, pale, sharp, silver in the early light. His eyes, not similar, not close. Exact. Staring up at him from a face that was half her mother and half a truth he had never been told. His breath left him in a single fractured sound. Not a word. Not a name. Just the air being pulled from his body by something stronger than anything he had ever known. Then the second child appeared. A boy, quieter, slower, stepping out from behind the door frame like he had been watching the entire time and had only now decided to be seen. He stood apart, small hands at his sides, his features softer, more like hers, her steadiness written into every line of him. His eyes were dark, deep brown, calm and unreadable. He looked at Hadion the way men twice his age never dared to. Without flinching, Hadion's hands began to shake. Those hands had ended wars, signed orders that reshaped cities, held weapons with a calm that terrified dangerous men. Now they trembled at his sides like they belonged to someone who had never held power in his life. Revna. Her name came out broken, stripped of every layer of authority that had ever surrounded it. She did not react. Her expression remained still, composed, a wall built from years of silence and survival. The girl tugged at her mother's sleeve. "Mama, who is the man?" The question hit him somewhere beneath his ribs, somewhere unprotected, somewhere he had forgotten existed. Revna's arm moved around the girl, pulling her closer. Instinct, protection. "No one you need to know," she said, calm, practiced, a sentence she had rehearsed 1,000 times for a moment she always knew would come. Revna, please. His voice cracked on the second word. You should not be here. Without anger, without invitation, without anything that left room for negotiation. I looked for you. Every day. Every single day for 4 years. And now you have found me. Her voice did not waver. Now leave. The door began to close. His hand lifted, reaching towards something he could not touch. Something he had lost before he even knew it existed. The wood met the frame. The latch clicked, and the sound tore through him louder than any bullet, any explosion, and any silence that had ever filled the rooms she had left behind. Inside, her voice carried faintly, soft, controlled, soothing the children back into the safety of a morning that had almost been ordinary. He should leave. That is what she wanted. What pride demanded. What any man with an empire waiting for his return would do. He lowered himself onto the stone step instead. The cold seeped through immediately. He did not care. He pressed his palms together, lowered his head, and stayed. Because inside that cottage were 2 children he had never known existed, and he had just run out of reasons to be anywhere else in the world. From behind the door, the girl's voice drifted through, small and curious. Mama, why did he sit down? A pause. Then Revna's voice, quieter, tighter, carrying something she would never say out loud. Because some people do not know when they are not wanted, little bird. And outside, in the fog and the salt and the cold, the most powerful man in 4 cities pressed his forehead to his clasped hands and made himself small for the first time in his life. Not because he was broken, because he had just found the only thing worth breaking for. The night I stopped believing did not start with cruelty. It started with kindness, and that is why it cut so deep. I need to go back further than that night, to the version of me that existed before him, because without her, none of this makes sense. I was 22 when I whispered those words. Not to anyone, not to him. To myself, standing in a service corridor of the Albrun Hotel, wearing a uniform that smelled like bleach, pressing my forehead against a supply closet door, while a banquet roared on the other side. Nobody wants a girl like me. I said it the way you say things that have been true for so long they stop hurting and just become facts. The scar had made sure of that. 7 years old, a house fire that took my mother and left me with a face the world could not look at without flinching. Foster homes after that, each one shorter than the last, each family finding a reason that was never about the scar, but always about the scar. By the time I aged out of the system, I had learned the only lesson that mattered. Do not wait to be chosen. No one is coming. So I worked. I cleaned rooms that rich men destroyed and rebuilt them before morning. I disappeared into the machinery of a world that needed me invisible to function. And I was good at it. Invisible was something I had practiced my entire life. I did not know he was standing behind me when I said it. The corridor was supposed to be empty, staff only. But he was there, leaning against the wall, arms folded, watching me with an expression I had never seen directed at me before. Not pity. Not the quick look away that most people offered when they noticed the scar. Something else entirely. That is not true, he said. Quiet. Simple. Like he was correcting a small, obvious error. I turned too fast, startled, already assembling the apology I had learned to carry for existing in spaces where people like me were not supposed to be seen. But he did not give me room to deliver it. What is your name? He asked. I told him. And that was the first time Hédion Valeri looked at me like I was not something to be pitied, fixed, or overlooked. It was the first time anyone had. What followed was not a fairy tale. It was slow, careful, built on small moments that accumulated into something I did not recognize until it was already holding me together. He returned to the hotel. Then again. Then again. Not for the events hosted in its glittering halls. For me. He was patient in a way that terrified me because patience from powerful men usually meant something else. But with him, it was just patience. He looked at my face, the whole of it, scar and all, without performing comfort. He did not try to save me. He simply made space for me to exist in his world, and then waited to see if I would choose to stay. I stayed. That was my first real choice, and for 3 years I believed it was the right one. I believed it through the whispers of his men, who never understood why someone like him would choose someone like me. I believed it through the silence of rooms that went quiet when I entered. I believed it because he never wavered. Because when the world made me feel like I did not belong, he made me feel like the world was wrong. Then one night, I stopped believing. The estate was quiet. Most of his men had gone. I had been resting, a heaviness in my body that I did not yet understand pulling me toward sleep earlier than usual. But something woke me. Not a sound. A feeling. The kind that settles into your chest and refuses to leave. I went to his study. The door was open, just enough, and I almost turned back. Almost chose the version of the truth that kept my world intact. But I stepped inside, and there, spread across his desk, was a letter bearing his signature. Formal, precise, addressed to a name I did not recognize. The terms of the arrangement are accepted. Revna Soren will be removed from the estate prior to the union. Her safety following departure is not a matter that requires further discussion. I read it 3 times. Each time, the words stayed the same. Each time, the ground beneath me became less solid. Removed. Not released. Not let go. Removed. Like an obstacle. Like a stain on an arrangement worth more than a scarred girl from nowhere. My hands did not shake. I did not cry. A door inside me simply closed, the kind that had always been waiting for a reason to shut. Then I heard his voice from the corridor, not speaking to me, speaking to Mirek, his closest man, the one who had stood beside him longer than anyone. "Is it done?" Mirek asked. "It is done." Hadion's voice, or what sounded exactly like it. "And her?" A pause, then, quieter. "She will be handled before the end of the week." The air left my lungs, slowly, like my body was learning how to exist without the one thing it had been relying on. I set the letter down exactly where I had found it, straightened the edge until it aligned perfectly with the others. Then I walked out of the room, out of the only life that had ever made me feel whole, and I did not look back. The woman who had believed she was wanted died in that study, and the one who walked away was someone I did not yet know. I did not run. Running is what frightened people do, and I could not afford to be frightened. Not yet. Not until I was far enough away that fear could no longer get me killed. I moved through the estate the way I had always moved through it. Quietly. Without drawing attention. The hallways were dim, and the few staff members still on duty did not look twice at me. They never had. That was the advantage of being someone the world had trained itself to overlook. When you needed to disappear, you were already halfway there. I returned to the small room I had kept as my own, not the grand suite with its wide windows and the scent of him woven into everything. The smaller one, the one I retreated to on nights when the estate felt too large, and my place within it felt too borrowed. The only space in that fortress that had ever truly been mine. I packed one bag. Not the clothes he had bought me, not the jewelry that arrived in velvet boxes, not the shoes that cost more than every foster home I had ever lived in combined. I left all of it. Taking those things would mean I had believed they were mine. I took what mattered. A photograph of my mother, creased and faded, recovered from my grandmother's belongings after the fire. A change of clothes that predated his world entirely. Cash I had been quietly setting aside for reasons I never examined until this moment, and the plain silver ring I had worn since I was 17, bought with my first paycheck, the first thing I ever owned that no one gave me out of obligation. I paused at the door. Just once. His jacket draped over the chair from 2 nights ago. A book I had been reading, spine cracked open to a page I would never finish. A glass of water on the nightstand, still half full, belonging to a woman who had planned to come back to bed. I closed the door without looking at any of it. The back corridors of the estate were built for people who were not meant to be seen. Delivery routes, staff passages, service tunnels that connected the kitchens to the outer grounds, without crossing a single room that mattered. I knew them all. 3 years of living inside a fortress teaches you every exit, even the ones no one thinks to guard. No one stopped me. No one called out. The invisible girl was doing what she had always done best, vanishing without leaving a mark. The air outside was sharp and cold. Late autumn. The estate rose behind me, all stone and iron, lit from within like something alive. I did not turn around. Do not look back. Not for him. Not for the life. Not for the version of yourself that once believed she had finally found a place where she was wanted. I walked past the outer gate during the shift change, timing my steps to the gap between one guard's departure and another's arrival. 14 seconds. I had counted them months ago without knowing why. Now I knew. The car I reached was a service vehicle, plain, parked in a lot that no one checked because nothing valuable was ever kept there. I started the engine, pulled onto the access road, and drove into a darkness that stretched wider than anything I had ever faced. The road ahead had no shape, no destination, no promise, just distance, growing between me and the man I had believed would never let me go. I was wrong about that too. He had not let me go. He had signed me away. And the girl who once whispered that nobody wanted her had been right all along. She just forgot for a while. And somewhere behind me, in a fortress of stone and silence, a man who had never known what it meant to lose something irreplaceable was about to learn. But not yet. First, he would have to notice I was gone. And by the time he did, I planned to be no one again. I drove for 2 days, not toward anything, away from everything. The roads narrowed as the cities fell behind me, turning from highways to back roads to dirt paths built for people who did not want to be followed. I ate what I could find at stations where no one looked twice at a woman traveling alone with tired eyes and nothing worth stealing. The coast appeared on the third morning like something the world had been hiding. Gray water stretching to the edge of the sky, cliffs dropping into foam and stone, and a wind that carried salt and silence in equal measure. I had never seen the ocean before. Not like this. Not wild and untouched, and completely indifferent to everything happening on its shore. Marrow Cove sat at the bottom of a narrow road that wound down through scrub grass and weather-beaten rock. A handful of stone cottages clustered near a small harbor. No cameras, no black cars, no one watching from windows with purpose behind their eyes. Just a village that existed because someone had decided to live here once, and no one had ever found a reason important enough to change it. I parked at the edge of town and sat there for a long time, watching the water through the windshield. My body ached. My mind was quieter than it had been in days. Not at peace, just empty. The kind of silence that comes after everything worth saying has already been spent. The inn was the first place I found. Not because I was looking for it, but because the door was open, and the warmth that came through it pulled at something instinctive. Heat. Shelter. The most basic promises a building can make. The woman behind the desk looked up when I entered. She was older, perhaps 60, with thick gray hair cut short and hands that looked like they had spent decades doing the kind of work that left permanent marks. Her eyes moved over me once, taking in the exhaustion, the single bag, the scar, and she did not flinch. She simply looked, the way someone does when they have seen enough of life to stop being surprised by any of it. "Room or work?" she asked, like those were the only two things anyone ever came to Marrow Cove for. "Both," I said. She nodded. "Room is upstairs. Small, but it locks from the inside. Work starts at dawn. Kitchen and linens. Pay is weekly. Cash only. No questions. No name required. Just an exchange. Simple, clean, survivable." Her name was Dagny. She had run the Salt Lantern for 31 years, alone for the last 12 since her husband drowned in a winter squall she did not talk about. She told me this on the second day, not as a confession, but as a fact. I settled into the work the way water settles into cracks. Quietly, completely, filling every space that would have me. No one asked who I was. No one asked where I came from. To the people of Marrow Cove, I was just another woman who had washed up on their shore, and they had seen enough of those to know that questions only made people leave faster. Weeks passed. The car I had arrived in sat untouched until Dagny's nephew towed it away for scrap. The last physical tie to the world I had left behind, gone without ceremony. Then the sickness started. It came in the early morning, sharp and sudden, while I was folding linens. A wave of nausea so strong it buckled my knees. I told myself it was exhaustion, stress. But it came again the next day, and the day after that. Each morning, stronger, more insistent, like a truth inside me demanding to be acknowledged. Dagny noticed before I said a word. She watched me grip the counter one morning, and her expression shifted into recognition. "How far along?" she asked quietly. The clinic confirmed what Dagny had already seen. Pregnant. Several weeks along. Likely before I left. I sat in Dagny's car afterward, staring at the ocean, and for the first time since I walked out of that estate, the numbness cracked. Inside, the shape of everything I had built in this quiet place changed permanently. I was no longer just a woman who had run. I was carrying proof that I had once belonged to someone. And if he ever discovered that proof existed, he would not just come for me. He would come for what was his. And men like Hadion Valeri did not ask permission to take what they believed belonged to them. My hands found my stomach, pressing flat against fabric and skin, and I made a second promise to myself, quieter than the first but infinitely heavier. I would not just disappear. I would become no one. Because now it was not just my life I was hiding. It was theirs. The storm arrived 3 weeks before it was supposed to matter. The doctor had told me I had time, weeks, possibly more, but the sea does not care about schedules. And neither, it turned out, did the life growing inside me. The first contraction hit while I was closing the kitchen for the night, a sharp tearing pressure that stole the breath from my lungs and locked my hands around the edge of the sink. I stood there, water running over my wrists, and tried to convince myself it was nothing. The second one came 4 minutes later and shattered every lie I had left. Dagny found me on the kitchen floor. She did not panic. She did not ask questions. She knelt beside me and spoke in a voice that carried the same steady authority as the tide. "It is time," she said. Not a question. The drive to the clinic dissolved into fragments. Rain hammering the windshield so hard the road disappeared. Dagny's hands on the wheel, steady as stone. My fingers gripping the seat until my knuckles turned white. And between every wave of pain, a silence so vast it swallowed everything except the sound of my own heartbeat and the storm tearing the world apart outside. Everything moved quickly after that. Voices I could not separate, hands guiding me. The storm pressed against the walls like it had something at stake in what was about to happen. Then suddenly, there were two of us. The first cry broke through everything. The storm, the pain, the years of silence I had wrapped around myself like armor. Loud, fierce, uncompromising. A girl placed into my arms before I was ready, her face scrunched in what looked less like distress and more like fury at being made to wait. Her eyes opened almost immediately, and the room shifted. Gray, pale, clear, silver gray. His eyes staring up at me from a face that had not yet learned to hide anything. My chest tightened in a way that had nothing to do with the labor. Because there it was, the connection I had tried to sever, tried to outrun, tried to bury beneath distance and silence, and a new name in a town no one remembered, written into her face before she had taken her 10th breath. I almost broke then, but there was no time. The second came quieter, arriving the way dawn arrives after a long night, not with force, but with certainty. A boy. His cry was barely a sound at all, more of an observation, as if he had entered the world and immediately decided to study it before passing judgment. They placed him beside his sister, and he settled against her like he had been waiting for her to arrive first so he could follow at his own pace. His hair was dark, his features softer, more like mine, and his eyes, when they finally opened, were deep brown. My eyes, carrying the same quiet patience I had spent a lifetime mistaking for weakness. Twins. I had prepared for one child, one life to protect, one secret to carry. This was something else entirely. 2 heartbeats depending on mine, 2 futures built on my ability to stay invisible, 2 pieces of evidence that would lead him straight to me if even one of them was ever seen by the wrong person. The storm weakened. The world reassembled itself, and in the quiet that followed, I held them both and tried to breathe. The girl moved first, her tiny hand finding my shirt and gripping it with a strength that startled me. She demanded space the way fire demands air naturally, without apology. She would be like him. The boy rested against my arm, his weight barely there. His presence felt more than seen. He watched. He observed the world like he was memorizing it for later. He would be like me. I named her Nola. I chose it because the sound felt unbendable, the kind of name that would refuse to be made small, no matter who tried. I named him Emrys. I chose it because it was quiet and enduring, the kind of name that survives not by being loud but by simply never disappearing. Nola and Emrys, my children, my reason, my risk. The storm passed, the morning came, and for a few hours, wrapped in borrowed blankets in a clinic that smelled of salt and antiseptic, we were the only 3 people in the world. But mornings do not last. They never do. And somewhere far from this shore, in a city built on power and silence, the empire she had left behind was waking to find that the one thing it could not afford to lose had vanished completely. And the man at its center did not know yet how much she had taken with her. He did not notice she was gone until morning. That was the detail that would haunt him longer than anything else. Not the empty room, not the missing bag. It was the hours between her leaving and his knowing, hours where he had existed in a world she had already left, sleeping in rooms she had already walked out of forever. By the time the absence registered, it had already become a wound. The estate was searched within the hour. Every room, every corridor, every exit examined with precision. His men moved quickly, but their eyes told him what their words would not. She was gone, not taken, gone. Voluntarily, deliberately, without a trace. A woman who is taken leaves evidence. A woman who leaves on her own takes only what is hers and closes every door behind her. Revna had done exactly that. The clothes he had given her hung untouched. The jewelry remained in its cases. The only things missing were things she had owned before he ever knew her name. She had not been stolen from him. She had walked away. And that was worse. He sent men, trackers, contacts, people who could find ghosts in crowded cities. They found the service vehicle abandoned 60 miles south, wiped clean, Nothing inside except the faint smell of her perfume caught in the upholstery. After that, nothing. She had vanished the way only someone who had spent a lifetime being invisible could vanish. Weeks became months. The search consumed resources that should have been directed elsewhere. Deals stalled. Alliances were neglected. Men who had stood confidently in his presence began to hesitate, sensing something fracturing beneath the surface. Hadean Valeri had built an empire on control. Now control was the one thing he could not maintain. Mirek watched it happen. He stood where he always stood, one step behind, patient, reliable. He offered counsel. He kept the structure intact while Hadeon tore through every lead, every shadow that might have contained her. And no one questioned Mirek. No one ever had. It was not a single moment that broke the truth open. It was an accumulation, small fractures that connected into a pattern visible only to a man who had stopped trusting what was in front of him and started examining what was behind it. He returned to the study one evening. Everything was in its place, but a detail refused to sit properly. He opened the desk. One file was thinner than it should have been. A transaction record, routine, except that the dates did not align. A meeting logged on a night Hadeon had not attended. A communication routed through a channel he had never authorized. He started pulling threads. Each thread led to another. Financial transfers disguised as operational expenses. Contacts traced to the Serova family, a rival operation that had spent years circling his territory without ever striking directly. Messages exchanged in codes that Mirek himself had designed, codes Hadeon had never been given access to because he had trusted the man who created them. Then, he found the letter. Filed under a name that did not exist, bearing a signature so close to his own that it would have fooled anyone who was not him. It described an arrangement he had never agreed to, an alliance with the Serovas, a marriage to consolidate power, and the removal of the woman who stood in the way. His hand pressed flat against the desk. She had seen this. She had stood in this room, read these words, and believed they were his. She had believed he had signed her away like a liability. The realization arrived with ice. Mirek had not just betrayed him. He had built a lie so carefully constructed that it became the only truth Revna had. A forged letter. A voice she would have recognized, mimicked or recorded. Speaking words he never said. A corridor conversation staged for an audience of one. Every detail designed to break the single bond that made Hadeon Valeri something other than a machine. They had not attacked his empire. They had attacked his humanity. What followed was not vengeance. Vengeance implies emotion. This was disassembly. The Serova family unraveled over months, each piece removed with a patience that made the destruction feel inevitable. By the end, there was nothing left to rebuild. Mirek was last. The man who had stood one step behind for 15 years simply ceased to exist, in the same way he had tried to make Revna cease to exist. Quietly, completely, without ceremony. And when it was over, Hadeon stood in the same study where everything had broken and understood a truth that no amount of power could soften. He had won. Every threat eliminated. Every wall rebuilt. And none of it mattered. Because she was still gone. The children he did not yet know existed were growing somewhere beyond his reach. And the only woman who had ever chosen him instead of what he controlled had spent years believing he had thrown her away. The search changed. He stopped sending men and started looking himself. Through patience. Through the kind of focus that had no room for pride or sleep or the possibility of failure. Because somewhere, in a place small enough to be invisible, she was alive. And this time, he would not trust anyone else to find her. It was not her face that found him. It was theirs. The image arrived quietly through a channel so minor it should not have mattered. A village council website for a place called Marrow Cove had posted photographs from a summer harbor festival. Fishing boats draped in colored flags, children chasing each other across stone docks. And in the background of the fourth photograph, standing slightly apart from the crowd, a girl. She was small, not yet 4, holding a stick of something sweet in one hand and gripping a woman's leg with the other. Her face was turned toward the camera, caught mid-glance by a shutter that did not know what it had captured. Her eyes were gray, pale, sharp, unmistakable silver gray. The man who found it had been searching for 4 years. He had scanned thousands of images and followed leads that dissolved into nothing so many times the work had become habit. But those eyes stopped him cold. He sent the photograph. Nothing else. Nothing else was needed. When the file opened on Hadion's screen, the room ceased to exist. He stared at the image longer than a man who prided himself on instant decisions should have allowed. But those were his eyes. In a child he had never met, in a village he had never heard of, in a life that had been built entirely without him. His first instinct was to send a team, but the impulse died before it could take hold. He had trusted other men once. That trust had cost him everything. He stood. The room shifted around him the way it always did when he moved with purpose. Conversations stopped. Eyes lowered. No one asked where he was going because the expression on his face made it clear that whatever was happening was not something that invited discussion. The drive took 7 hours. The city shrank behind him, replaced by roads that narrowed and roughened until they became little more than suggestions carved into hillside and rock. The landscape changed from steel and glass to stone and scrubgrass to open sky and gray water. Everything grew quieter the further he went, as if the world itself was thinning, shedding weight, becoming something simpler and harder to find. By the time he reached Marrow Cove, the sky was still dark. Early morning fog rolled in from the water, thick and white, turning the village into a place that barely existed. The cottages were dim. The harbor was still. The only sound was the tide pulling at the shore and the cry of birds that had not yet learned to be afraid of anything. He parked at the edge of town and sat in the silence for a long time. His hands rested on the wheel. 4 years. Every resource. Every sleepless night. Every room that still carried the faint ghost of her presence. All of it had led here, to a forgotten village on a coastline that no one with power would ever think to look at. He stepped out into the cold and walked. The salt lantern. A faded sign above a door that looked like it had been opened 10,000 times. Warm light glowed faintly from inside. He stopped at the path. The fog pressed close. And then the door opened, and every moment of the last 4 years collapsed into a single, unbearable second. She was there. The children were there. His children. And the door closed before he could say enough to matter. But this time, he did not walk away. He did not send someone else. He did not retreat into the machinery of control that had failed him once already. He sat down on her front step. And he stayed. Because the man who once believed that power meant never waiting for anything had finally found something worth every second of stillness he had left. He did not leave that first day, or the second, or the third. By the 4th morning, the village had stopped pretending not to notice. He was there before dawn every day, sitting on the low ledge outside the salt lantern, his coat pulled tight against the coastal wind, his posture still in a way that made him look less like a man waiting and more like something the landscape had decided to keep. Inside, Revna felt him the way you feel a change in pressure before a storm. Not through sight or sound, but through something deeper. Something her body recognized before her mind allowed it. She moved through her mornings with the same careful precision she had built over 4 years, preparing breakfast, folding linens, keeping the rhythm of the inn steady and predictable. But the rhythm was different now, disrupted by a presence she could not fold away or wipe clean. Nola broke first. She was not built for restraint. On the second morning, she pressed her face against the window so hard her nose flattened against the glass. "Mama, the man is still sitting there." "I know. Is he not cold?" "He is fine." "He does not look fine. He looks like the fishermen look when the boats do not come back." The observation landed harder than it should have from a child who had not yet learned to measure the weight of her words. By the third day, Nola had begun leaving things near the door. Not for him, she insisted. Just near the door. A biscuit wrapped in cloth. A cup she claimed she had accidentally filled with tea. Small offerings disguised as accidents. On the fourth morning, the biscuit was gone. Nola noticed immediately, her entire body vibrating with satisfaction. "Mama, he ate it. We should make him soup." "We are not making him soup, Nola. But Dagny says we feed anyone who is hungry. That is the rule." Revna closed her eyes. The logic of children is merciless in its simplicity, and Nola wielded it like a weapon she did not know she held. Emrys said nothing through all of this. He watched from his usual place, a small chair near the hearth where he sat with a book he could not yet read, turning pages with the deliberate patience of someone who believed understanding would come if he simply kept going. He did not press his face to the window. He did not ask questions. But his eyes tracked his mother's movements with a focus that missed nothing. On the fifth evening, after Nola had fallen asleep mid-sentence the way she always did, surrendering to exhaustion only when her body physically overruled her will, Emrys spoke. "He is still there." It was not a question, it was a confirmation. "Yes." "He is not going to leave." The certainty in his voice unsettled her more than anything Nola had said. Because Nola spoke from curiosity, Emrys spoke from observation, and observation, in her experience, was rarely wrong. "No," she admitted quietly. "I do not think he is." Emrys returned to his book, turning another page he could not read, as if the matter had been settled. Dagny held her silence for 5 days, which was, for Dagny, an act of extraordinary restraint. On the 6th morning, she stood beside Revna at the kitchen counter, drying a pot with a cloth, and spoke without looking up. "That man outside is going to catch pneumonia and die on my doorstep, and I will have to explain it to the constable. He can leave whenever he chooses. He clearly cannot." Dagny set the pot down. "Whatever he did to you, a man who sits in the cold for 6 days is not a man who came to take something. He is a man who came to ask for it." Revna's hand stilled on the counter. The distinction landed somewhere between the anger she had carried for 4 years and the exhaustion she had never admitted to. He was not forcing his way in. He was not using the weight of who he was to demand anything. He was simply there, present, patient, stripped of every weapon except his willingness to wait. And that terrified her. Because force she knew how to resist. Force had a shape she could push against. But patience looked like something else entirely. It looked like a man who meant it. She came to him on the 7th evening. Not because she had forgiven him. Not because patience had worn her down. But because the silence between them had become a weight she could no longer carry alongside everything else. The children were asleep. The inn was quiet. Dagny had retired early with a look that said more than words ever could. Revna stepped onto the porch and closed the door behind her. He was exactly where he always was, sitting on the bottom step, his shoulders carrying the weight of 7 days of waiting. He looked up when the door opened, slowly, like he had trained himself not to expect anything. "The letter," she said finally. Not a question, a starting point. His jaw tightened. "You saw it." "I read it 3 times. Your signature. Your words. My name listed as something to be removed. It was not my signature. It looked exactly like yours. It was designed to. Every stroke practiced until it was indistinguishable. I did not know it existed until months after you were gone." She crossed her arms. "And the voice. In the corridor. Speaking to Mirek about handling me before the end of the week." Pain crossed his expression, raw and immediate. That was not me. It was a recording, spliced from conversations, played at the exact moment you would hear it. Mirek knew where you would be. He knew when you would come to the study. He arranged every detail so that what you found would be impossible to question. That is very convenient. It is the truth. I spent 11 months tearing apart every piece of evidence until the proof was undeniable. Why would Mirek do that? He stood beside you for 15 years. Because someone paid him to. The Serova family. They had been circling my territory for years, waiting for an opening that force could not create. They found it. He paused. You. Me. You were the one thing I never protected the way I protected everything else. Not because I did not value you, but because I never believed anyone would use you as a weapon. That was my failure, not yours. She turned toward the water, toward the darkness where the sea met the sky. You are telling me that the night I left, the letter, the conversation, all of it was constructed, designed to make me believe you had decided to throw me away. Yes. And the Sarovas? And Mirek? Gone. All of them. 4 years, she said quietly. I raised them alone for 4 years. I worked until my hands cracked. I stayed awake through fevers and storms and nights so long I forgot what morning felt like. I built a life out of nothing because I believed I had been thrown away by the one person who told me I was wanted. Her voice did not break, but it bent, just slightly, in a way that cut deeper than breaking would have. I know, he said. Do you? Because knowing is not the same as living it. Knowing is not waking up every morning and looking at a little girl with your eyes and telling yourself that the man who gave her those eyes signed a letter to have you erased. He absorbed it, every word, every ounce of weight she placed on him, like it was the least he owed her. You are right. I do not know what that felt like, and none of my suffering erases yours. She looked at him then, not through anger, not through armor, but through the smallest crack in something she had believed was permanent. He was not the same man. The man she remembered commanded rooms without speaking. This man sat on cold steps and asked for nothing. If everything you are telling me is true, she said slowly, then the life I built to survive you was built on a lie. The life you built was built on strength. The lie was the reason, not the result. An unfamiliar stillness settled through her. Not forgiveness, not trust. The possibility that the world she had understood for 4 years was not the world that had actually existed. And that was harder to accept than any betrayal. Because betrayal gave her something to fight against. This gave her nothing but open ground and the terrifying freedom to choose what came next. The morning it changed was not the morning she expected. There was no argument that demanded resolution. Just a small girl chasing a gull across the harbor stones on a morning when the tide was high and the rocks were slick with spray. Revna saw it before it happened. The way Nola's foot landed wrong, the way her balance shifted. She was already moving, already calling her name, already too far away. He was closer. He moved without thinking, without the controlled precision that had defined every action she had ever seen him take. He simply moved, catching Nola against his chest and pulling her back from the wet stone edge with hands that knew exactly how to hold something small without breaking it. Nola looked up at him. Her knee was scraped. Her eyes were wide. And instead of crying, she studied his face with the same fearless intensity she brought to everything. Are you my papa? The harbor went still. The gulls overhead seemed to pause. Even the tide held its breath. Hadion looked at her, at this small, fierce creature with his own eyes staring back at him. And something in his face broke open in a way that had nothing to do with weakness and everything to do with a truth he could no longer contain. Yes, he said. Quiet. Certain. like it was the only word he had ever been sure of. Nola considered this for approximately 2 seconds. Then she nodded, as if confirming something she had already decided, and wrapped her arms around his neck with the unguarded trust of a child who had simply been waiting for the right answer. Revna stood 10 feet away, her hand still extended from the reach that had not been fast enough, and watched a wall she had spent 4 years building come apart in a single moment she no longer wanted to undo. That evening, she found him on the porch. The same place, the same stillness. She sat beside him, not close enough to touch, just close enough to be there. "I am tired," she said, without armor, without strategy. "I am tired of carrying everything alone, tired of being angry at a ghost that was never you, tired of telling myself that I do not need anyone because needing someone once nearly destroyed me." He did not interrupt. He did not reach for her. He waited, the way he had been waiting for 7 days, for 4 years, for the entirety of a life that had only started to make sense, the night a scarred girl in a service corridor whispered something she believed was true. "I do not know how to fix what happened," she said. "You do not have to fix it. We just have to stop letting it be the only thing between us." She looked at him, at the lines the years had carved into his face, at the hands that had once terrified men and now held her daughter like she was made of something precious, at the man who had torn apart an empire to find a woman the world had told him was not worth keeping. "Nobody wants a girl like me," she said quietly. Not the way she had said it in that corridor years ago. Not with defeat. With something else. A question, maybe? Or a test. Or the last piece of something she needed to let go of before she could move forward. He looked at her, and for the first time since he had arrived in Marrow Cove, he smiled. Not the way powerful men smile, with calculation behind it. The way someone smiles when they finally get to say the thing they have been carrying for longer than they can remember. "That," he said softly, "was never true." She did not collapse into him. She did not cry. She leaned, just slightly, just enough that her shoulder rested against his, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. The tide came in. The village settled. The fog rolled gently across the harbor like it was tucking the world into sleep. The ceremony, when it came, was not in a cathedral or a grand estate. It was in Dagny's garden behind the salt lantern, where the lavender grew wild and the stone wall held the warmth of the afternoon sun. Nola threw flower petals with the intensity of someone launching a military campaign. Emrys stood beside his mother, quiet and certain, holding her hand not because he needed to, but because he wanted her to know he was there. There were no guests who measured worth in power. Just a woman who had learned to survive by becoming invisible, and a man who had learned that the only thing worth seeing had been in front of him all along. And when he spoke, it was not as a man claiming something. It was as a man asking. And when she answered, it was not because she had forgotten the years. It was because she had decided that the years still to come mattered more. In the end, it was never about power. It was about the moment a girl who believed she was unwanted met a man who refused to let her be right. And he stayed until she believed it.